Thank you all. My hope is that when this panel is done, you will remember Ken Oliver's panel is the happy, optimistic one. Because we're going to get real on Mexico. Who was it in the audience who just asked the question about the confluence between the Mexican state and the cartels? It was someone out here. Ma'am, this panel is for you. You get a full panel. We were planning it beforehand, but thanks for teeing it up. My name is Joshua Treviño. I am the Chief of Intelligence and Research and Director for Texas Identity at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Those of you who've worked in D.C. know that the longer your title is, the less important you are. So I'm trying to break the mold, but it is a long title. One of the things that I do as a native South Texan is concern myself with the border and border security. Obviously, it is an area of keen interest for us as a foundation. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, in addition to policy on the Texas and U.S. side, is what's happening in Mexico? We have to understand what's happening in Mexico to make good policy here in Texas and in the United States. I say the United States and not Washington, D.C., because D.C.'s record in good policymaking vis-a-vis the border is not great. But there's a lot we can do here in Texas. Let me give you a few vignettes to kick things off. Consider, if you will, the current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, goes by AMLO, his initials, traveling to the hamlet of Badiraguato in Sinaloa to pay homage to the mother of El Chapo and his lawyer, simply saying that he could not resist the accolades of an elderly woman. He has needs, he says. Let me give you another vignette. The Instituto Nacional de Migración, INM, which is effectively the Mexican Migration Institute, a governmental entity that is supposed to see to the well-being and treatment of the many migrants who pass through Mexico. We go to Mexico City and we hear from multiple sources that the man in charge of it these days is a human trafficker himself. And we are told that migrants at the border heading north currently pay 3 sets of taxes. They pay one set of tax to the cartel controlling their crossing. They pay another tax to the Mexican state as such. They're actually taxed, which ought to tell you about the degree of control that the Mexican state actually has. And they pay a separate tax to INM, to the Migration Institute, to kick up to that actual cartel masquerading as a government agency that sees them through. Or consider the case of General Cienfuegos, arrested in December 2020, the former Mexican de facto Secretary of Defense, their equivalent, and head of the armed forces there, who turned out to be also El Padrino, the godfather of the cartel bosses. Or consider Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the civilian head of the Mexican security apparatus under President Felipe Calderón, also arrested, currently in prison in the United States, because he too, this would be the equivalent of arresting the director of the FBI, for example, which there may be other cause for, but bear with me in this. Himself a known cartel boss. And then finally consider that at the trial of El Chapo here in the United States, which by the way is his 3rd arrest, to make it stick, they had to bring him here. There is testimony to the effect that the former president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, this is unproven, but it's in the trial, took a 7-figure bribe from El Chapo simply to continue operations. The journalist Jose Gamboa, a Mexican journalist, one of the good ones, tweeted out several days back, and I'll read the rough English translation. My Spanish is terrible. That's how you know I really am a South Texas Tejano. The tragedy of Mexico, he said, the tragedy of Mexico is that what is subjugating the country is drug trafficking. But instead of fighting it, the entire structure of government powers is linked in a large criminal association. Jose Gamboa was stabbed to death after tweeting that about 3 or 4 days back. So the question before us today is, how do we get real on Mexico, and what is the intersection between the Mexican state and the criminal organizations that appear to increasingly run it? Trump's ambassador, Chris Landau, remarked several months ago that about 35 to 40% of Mexico is now not in the control of the Mexican state, is under control of cartels. It caused a firestorm, but he spoke the truth. With us today are 2 men who I'm pleased to call friends and colleagues. David Agren, a freelance journalist, directly to my left, has covered Mexico and Latin America since 2005, reporting on politics, security, immigration, and religion. So for our interns in the room, you were in kindergarten. And his writing appears regularly in Catholic News Service, USA Today, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, and The Lancet. Strongly recommend that you follow him if you're interested in what's going on in Mexico. On Twitter, he's at El Reportero. And you've lived in Mexico City since '05, correct? You'll need the. You'll need.
Since '07,
Okay.
I went to Guadalajara to work at an English weekly in 2005. And before that, I was a student in Colima.
Fantastic, fantastic. We also have with us John Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist. His writings appeared at the Federalist, also in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Texas Monthly, The Guardian, Claremont Review of Books, the New York Post, and elsewhere. You can follow him on Twitter at John D. Davidson. Strongly recommend that as well. John, I'm going to pitch to you first. You had an excellent article in the Federalist yesterday, really wrapping up, I think, in a way that had clarity that hadn't really been illuminated before on what's happening with the Mexican state in particular. Can you talk about that and some of the top lines that we need to know?
I was getting ready for this panel. That's why I wrote the article.
It's worth
all my notes for it. The article, which I think ran yesterday at the Federalist, is the headline is something like, "The border crisis is bad, but a larger crisis in Mexico looms." And you know, it's hard to talk about the border just if you're just talking about the border. I mean, we saw in the previous panel, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different players. There's a lot of different players on the U.S. side and on the Mexican side, and it's ever shifting. There's not a great grasp of how the border works, just in the American public generally, and certainly not in the corporate press. But it's even harder, I think, to talk about Mexico and how the criminal organizations that effectively control northern Mexico and control what I call the industrialization of illegal immigration, how they interact with the Mexican state. And the article that I wrote tried to kind of get at that because there's a complex web in Mexico of criminality that shoots all the way through, you know, nearly every layer of civil society, local government, state government, federal government, law enforcement at all levels of society, involving the military, involving the INM, and involving government at the very highest levels. The equivalent of the FBI director, the equivalent of the sort of Joint Chiefs of Staff, the equivalent of the president, in the case allegedly of Enrique Peña Nieto. So the thrust of it is, you know, we hear a lot, and we hear a lot on both sides. Sort of Republicans and Democrats have a similar way of talking about this, to the extent that a lot of Democratic politicians even pretend to care about the border. In South Texas, they do, but they're increasingly sort of shunned by party leadership. Talk about how, you know, we need to partner with Mexico, and we need to have a partner in Mexico in order to really sort of solve the border crisis long term and address the root causes of the border crisis. And I think that we need to ask ourselves a question: to what extent Mexico is a partner in that effort, and to what extent Mexico can even be a partner in that effort. And I think the more you sort of pull on that thread, the more it becomes clear that Mexico isn't a partner and isn't going to be a partner. And we need to start thinking realistically about that.
David, back in early December, Ken Oliver and I had the opportunity to meet with an official, state-level official from northern Mexico, so I'll leave him unidentified. But one of the questions I had for him was kind of this curious intersection between the current president of Mexico and the Sinaloan cartel, which is one of the majors, if not the major cartel in Mexico. And his answer surprised me. He said, "Oh, they have an alliance." And I said, "Really? Are you saying the president of Mexico has an alliance with the Sinaloan cartel?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, absolutely. Everybody knows it." Can you talk about how that perception has arisen and how we should understand it?
One of the curious things about this president, he's never had a crossword for narcos, for anyone in the drug cartels. He's had bad words for journalists, for the middle class, for conservatives, for feminists who he accused of being conservatives. It's just every morning he gets up in his press conference and it seems like there's some new enemy. But he's never had a bad word for the drug cartels. And I remember doing a story on after the arrest of El Chapo, and I went through all of the old AMLO press releases that I got over the years. And the day, I believe on Chapo's second arrest in 2015, 2016, I AMLO was touring the country as he did as an opposition figure, and he was in Sinaloa, and he spoke about the most dangerous cartel in the country is the Cartel de los Pinos, which was the presidential palace. So he was always able to sort of casually associate his opponents with, drug cartels, and it always just felt like he just. You could sort of, I think when I went up to Sinaloa in 2019, I went with him up into Badiraguato, which is El Chapo's home municipality, and everybody in town turned out. And he announced that they were going to finish building a road through the rugged Sierra Madre. What I think, what my read on it is that the price of opium poppies crashed because of fentanyl, and the price of marijuana crashed because of legalization in states like California. And so here comes AMLO as sort of this new benefactor promising social programs. And so I sort of felt like, in a way, he was just sort of appealing to a group that was using almost the same sort of benefactor-like tactics as the cartels. But, it turns out that the cartels did some political organizing for the Morena party in Sinaloa before the election. The opposition figures were kidnapped on the eve of the election and basically frozen. So is that collusion? I mean, we don't know. I mean, I think the most polite explanation that usually gets put in the press is just that the cartel acts in its own best interests, and that means supporting the party in power. And one of the things you get with drug cartels in Mexico is that they like to have a lot of, they corrupt on the local level more than the federal. That's sort of the perception. And that they do a lot of these, a lot of this just so that they have control of the territory. They can move drugs, they can move migrants, they can do what they can do what they need to do. And what you're noticing is that there's a lot of local level violence, political candidates being killed. I can't remember how many in the last election, 30 or so. And again, that's getting control of a local government, local police department. There's these narcos probably come with a construction company. There's these contracts. So you get control of the treasury. So it's, in a lot of parts of Mexico, it's sort of, and you see this in the slangs of so many journalists, and you don't know where the cartel's dominance ends and the state begins, and that's always the question you have when you're in some of these parts of Mexico.
I think you mentioned it, and I think there's two incidents that really illuminate kind of this interesting intersection between the president of Mexico, the current president, and now I can never go to Mexico again, by the way. And the Sinaloan cartel. And John, in a second, I'd like to pitch to you, talking about the battle in Culiacan in October 2019. But one thing that you referenced, David, I think deserves a little bit more exposition. And I want to emphasize before I share this anecdote that we can't prove anything about what I'm about to share with you. But we heard it in Mexico. And of course, when you're talking about these affairs, there's sort of a print the legend aesthetic that goes on with this. So let me share with you a completely unverified tale. State elections in Sinaloa last year, and a horrifically violent series of local elections. You mentioned, dozens of local candidates killed, probably by local criminal organizations. What we were told was that of the contending, there's multiple political parties in Mexico. There's three major ones, 3.5, depending on how you count it. But in Sinaloa in particular, there were two. There was the PRI, which held the governorship, and then there was the Morena coalition, which is actually the ruling coalition in Mexico City. What we were told by individuals who would know is that prior to Election Day, the Sinaloan cartel rolled out and kidnapped the whole pre-election apparatus. So we're talking poll watchers and people who drive old ladies to the polls and like phone bankers and pretty much rolling up the whole...
People that buy votes.
People that buy votes, even that, yeah, the most crucial of all, right? And so they're all kidnapped. They're not killed. They're taken away, and then after Election Day comes and goes, Morena, of course, is the only entity with an apparatus in the field, and they win the election. Surprise. And then they're released. They're released with threats, which is why nobody now will go on the record about what happened. Now, in full candor, can I prove it? Absolutely not. Do I believe it? Probably. I do. So that's one example. And John, I'd like to pitch to you on the battle in Culiacan, which I think is also illuminating.
Yeah, this was October of 2019, I believe. The Mexican National Guard, which AMLO created to be a sort of domestic law enforcement body that has since been used to has been used for immigration enforcement within Mexico, and is frankly quite a corrupt force. No surprise. They were tasked by the DEA to arrest El Chapo's son, Ovidio, I think his name is.
El Raton.
Ovidio.
Yeah.
Ovidio.
He's a 29-year-old, one of El Chapo's sons in the city of Culiacan. They arrest him, and all hell breaks loose. Sinaloans activate a rapid response force, which they have. So the cartels have sort of a tactical rapid response force that Americans are always sort of incredulous when you start talking about this stuff, because they don't realize how sophisticated and how well funded these organizations are. They have unlimited amounts of resources. They are very savvy, and I tell people, you don't think of them as a drug gang. Think of them as Halliburton. Okay, Sinaloa is in like 53 countries around the world. They're Halliburton if Halliburton did, drugs, chemical manufacturing, human trafficking, and extortion. That's what we're dealing with here. It's the largest criminal organizations in the world. So they activate the rapid response force, which includes custom-made armored vehicles with, fully automatic machine gun turrets on top of them. They completely shut down the entire city. They block off exits to the city, so they besiege the entire city. They surround the National Guard location where they're holding El Chapo's son. Then they send out hit squads to kidnap the families of the National Guard people who are holding El Chapo's son, and threaten them if they don't release this guy. And so the whole thing, and these images, and people, and this is not a small city. People, social media floods with these images of like burning semi-tractor trailers across freeways, of gunmen running through the streets, of these armored, vehicles that are cartel Humvees, basically.
It's the capital of the state.
It's probably 700,000 more. It's a good-sized city.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole thing ends when AMLO tells the National Guard to stand down, release the prisoners, and leave the city. And the message this sends, obviously, is that the cartels outmaneuvered and outgunned the Mexican military and forced, by order of the president, the release of one of their own, and basically stood down in humiliation. So this immediately calls into all kinds of questions about what is the hierarchy of authority and power in Mexico. If this is able to happen, and not clandestinely. This played out on social media in real time. There's people in the business district downtown who are just filming with their cell phones out the window as these armored vehicles come racing through. I think a dozen or more people were killed in the day's fighting.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it brings up all of these questions about if this can happen. What is the real power structure in Mexico? What's going on?
Didn't they? I may be misremembering this, so correct me if I'm wrong. But didn't the Sinaloans actually contact the presidency directly? I don't think it was mediated through.
I'm not sure.
Okay. So take that with a grain of salt. I may be wrong about that. The sophistication is something that's quite interesting. In recent days,
if I remember, the president was on a commercial flight to Oaxaca in Queretaro.
Oh, interesting. And he
for
popped on
for part of that time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then intervene as soon as he could.
Flying economy, and he tends to fly, Viva Aerobus, which is something akin to Spirit or.
Truly a man of the people.
Yeah. Well, he always gets the exit row.
Yeah. Just which people?
He said at the time, because he was criticized for this, and he later defended. He's like, "What? I did it to avoid bloodshed."
He still to this day makes no apologies for it, and
it's not his way.
But part of what's occurring in Mexico, I've seen statistics showing that there actually are fewer military. One thing the president says he wants to avoid is military civilians being killed, which is obviously understandable. What seems to be happening is there's a passivity, and some analysts I talk to sort of interpret that as, or say the cartels interpret that as permission to be somewhat audacious in their battles, and they are, and in a way they fight for territory. It's actually a very territorial disputes that they have. It's not just corrupting a government. Like
it's real sovereignty.
I mean,
being
take Nuevo Laredo. That's a very lucrative territory, and that's why there's constantly fights for it. The Cartel del Noreste has it, and there's always somebody trying to get it from them, and hence the violence.
And I remember growing up in an era when you could go to lunch in Nuevo Laredo shopping, and if you were daring, get dental work as well. So those days are over.
Just an anecdote from a trip to Nuevo Laredo in July. I went the carretera, the highway between Monterrey and Nuevo Laredo. A lot of people went missing, and the families in Mexico, what families do is families will organize their own search parties to go look for disappeared persons. And so we set out from Monterrey, 2 hours up the highway, 4 women that do and then a group of something called Pro Búsqueda that searches for them, and all kinds of security forces. And what normally happens is they get to a stretch of land, and this was about the state line between Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, which is about, 25 kilometers south of the border. Maybe a little more, and then they were going to go off into a rural area, and they were going to fly a drone in there. If it's clear, they would go in. For some reason, the Tamaulipas State Police led us into a Nuevo Laredo where they were doing some sort of raid, and apparently we were just cover. And then they led us on this convoy through the city, and somebody came out and threw tire spikes and hit the vehicles. So we were all, I'm driving one of the vehicles, 4 journalists, and I just, hit the floor. This is right in central Nuevo Laredo. So they have spies in all locations, and they're audacious. And to this day, I still can't get an explanation as to why the police led us into that kind of danger.
Can you talk a little bit about the reports that we hear in places like Jalisco and Michoacan, particularly, but not just them, of the army essentially playing an adjudicating role between criminal cartels, no longer fighting them, but trying to maintain boundary lines and actually actively suppressing citizen attempts to fight cartels?
Well, the autodefensas, which is what's the word for that? Self-defense groups, or largely what happened in the state of Michoacan in 2013 was that the Tierra Caliente is this very hot, arid region where they grow a lot of limes and agriculture, and then with the agricultural infrastructure, they started growing other crops, and so what happened is people I interviewed that were involved in the beginning of this were just getting extorted, and they were paying a tax on every lime that was picked, packaged, sold, and then they started paying. It got to the point where you had a part of the fees to use the public toilet went to the cartel, and so they finally rose up against it and grabbed guns, and it became the Mexican government at the time just did not want this news to get out. And various Catholic priests started saying, hey, our towns are being besieged. And so, unfortunately, the self-defense groups pretty much became corrupted. And the government co-opted some, and then others became corrupted, and obviously turned into illegal activity. So one of the challenges in some of these, I'm on a bit of a diversion, but I'll get back to this, in Mexico is when in some of these places where you have such lengthy histories of organized crime activity, it's very hard not to be impacted or touched by it in some way. And that's not I don't say that to cast aspersions on people. It's just it's very, very hard to avoid it when it's so pervasive. But what's happening is you have a cartel. Basically, you have the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is on the other side of the border. We're talking on the Pacific coast, going south of Manzanillo towards Ixtapa, or sorry, the Port of Lázaro Cárdenas and Ixtapa, And they want into Michoacan, and they just have never been able to displace the alliance of cartels that are there and autodefensas. And the military, for whatever reason, seems to be idle. And, you know, talking to priests in there, I know one priest that what's happened is that the cartel will just, the Jalisco cartel, they'll just break up the road. They will literally get out heavy equipment and break up the road, and you cannot get in or out. And so one of the Catholic priests I interviewed just went and celebrated the Eucharist at one of these, you know, breaches in the road and called out the government. And one of the things that's interesting is this town where they was, Colcoman, they had built a military base there in the 2010s. Mm-hmm. And it's just, what are they doing? That's what you keep hearing from people in there. What are they doing? And apparently it's not stopping anyone.
Perhaps not what they ought. We only have a few minutes before we get to audience questions, but I want to throw out two, and I apologize for the brevity in this, but two big questions for both of you. And John, I'll start with you. I've had the privilege of working with both of you, both in Texas and in Mexico. We were in Mexico City back in December, doing a TPPF expedition, talking to a lot of folks in government and media and academia and so on. So you've had these conversations, obviously you and your profession, David. What's the narrative on the Mexican side when you're talking with somebody from the Mexican state, a government official, and you say, you know, it looks like there are these instances of collusion happening, there's a failure to exercise sovereignty. What's the line that you get back in return?
The line, if you're talking to somebody from the AMLO administration, is oh yes, our predecessors were very corrupt, and we're doing everything we can to fight that corruption and clean up the mess of the conservative party that was in, you know, the Calderon administration from 2006 to 2012, and they'll just say that to you with a straight face, or they'll come up with a line about. Well, yeah, we have our challenges, and you know, we have some corruption here, but you know, we have problems from the U.S. as well. We have you know, weapons coming into Mexico from the United States, bazookas and grenades and 50 caliber machine guns. They think those are coming in from the United States. They know, and we know that they're not. And one official even said, you know, imagine, you know, and the United States isn't doing anything about the weapons that are coming in to Mexico from the United States. Imagine if the Mexican authorities just let drugs come right up to the border and didn't do anything about it.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
I couldn't, you know, I mean, there's not much point arguing with somebody in the Mexican Foreign Ministry when you're there for a short meeting. But I just couldn't believe that I would hear something like that. But that's the line. So the official narrative and the official kind of thinking is totally divorced from reality or unwilling to acknowledge reality. And the reality is, David, as you mentioned, it's hard to tell in a lot of parts of Mexico, especially I think on the more local level, where the cartel kind of organized crime apparatus ends and the official state begins. Those things are blurred, so when it comes to these situations like in Tierra Caliente, you have the army and their barracks sitting there literally within eyesight of one cartel roadblock, you know, 500 meters down the road this direction, and another 500 meters down the road the other direction, both extorting the local population, and the army thinking that it's its job just to make sure that the two cartels don't interact. But other than that,
30 seconds.
Let me just really quick. One thing, what John just basically said was about they'll blame the past administration. This government, López Obrador lost a very close election in 2006 to Felipe Calderón, and he never conceded it. And one of the things that his people will always say, his supporters will always say, is that this war was started by Felipe Calderón, this drug war, sending the army into Michoacan to stamp out the cartels, was started to legitimize himself after such a contentious election and so many post-election protests. So in a way, this is like a foundational myth of this stolen election is a foundational myth, and out of that, the Lopez Obrador administration seems to see this as something that started under Calderon and they're stuck with. And then even the PRI under Peña Nieto that followed, the PRI always came in saying, we know how to govern. And that sort of inferred back to the days when the PRI did have all the local level, had all these alliances with drug cartels. There's no alliance to be had with drug cartels. They're too fragmented. So back in the days, you had a couple big bosses. Now, that's not Tamaulipas. It's just swear word show.
Let's go straight to audience Q&A. And unfortunately, I can't see anybody in the audience, so I'm going to take our folks. I'm sure somebody's gesturing. Would our friends with, there we go.
Here
Please.
I am.
Yes.
I'm Susie Wilson, and our family's had a large business in Mexico for over 100 years.
Wow.
And so we have watched many of the things that you have talked about. They're totally infiltrated the government. We had a large factory, and of course, the unions are connected to the drug cartel, and they took over the factory. My question is, I feel that the drug cartels have also infiltrated our government. I've watched it with the family business in Mexico. Why would we have the audacity to feel that they have not? I know Beto O'Rourke. His family lost their business because they were laundering money for the drug cartels. This is all fact. So why would we think that our government hadn't been infiltrated either?
I wasn't aware of the full record of Beto O'Rourke's lack of entrepreneurial success, so thank you. Look, I mean, I'll share two things on that. We know that there have been multiple South Texas sheriffs. The sheriff of Presidio County a few decades back, the sheriff of Hidalgo County, who was also named Treviño, not one of mine, but turned out to be a subcontractor for the Zetas.
The Zetas were
the Zetas with the Panama unit, yeah, exactly. And then the sheriff of Cameron County back in the day used to be, his nickname was Protect the Load Cantu. And so yes, I think it's unquestionable that at the local government level it's happening. There's also stuff that happens kind of at the top level. Back in the 90s, there was a fellow named Carlos Hank Gonzalez, who was basically the kingmaker in Mexican politics, and DOJ had him dead to rights. He was a cartel lord, deeply enmeshed with them. What he did when it looked like DOJ was gonna nail him for cartel ties was he hired former United States Senator Warren Rudman to lobby for him in Washington, D.C. And I kid you not, Attorney General Janet Reno not only disavowed her own people in DOJ, but then issued a public apology to Carlos Hank Gonzalez for besmirching his good name. So are we complicit? There's circumstantial evidence. Please go ahead.
I was going to say that Hank's nickname was a poor politician is a poor or his slogan was a poor politician is a poor politician.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yes.
This is specifically for David. Curious, I'm a former executive with a global bank, #1 bank in Mexico. Curious about the ties that you have any insights with between the banks and the cartels in Mexico. Wachovia had a huge, the only one that I'm really aware of from the United States is Wachovia's fine in 2010 or 11. Curious about those ties and then what the U.S. can do about it.
Well, there was correct me if was it HSBC that did what was sanctioned for doing a lot of work with the Sinaloa cartel. I'm trying to remember the year that they weren't. There was some HSBC issue. Boy, with banking, I haven't explored that as closely as I should. I think the one thing, Mexico received record remittances this year. El Sol de Mexico, which was a very large, newspaper, they did a study suggesting that a lot of the cartel, that oddly a lot of drug-controlled territory were receiving remittances. It wasn't just people why were so many remittances going to Sinaloa, for example? It's a migrant state, but not an especially big one. So I think there's a lot of questions about remittances, and I think that's where a lot of it comes in. You notice City Banamex is going to be sold. boy, I don't know how to say this without getting into trouble, but there's
Do you want me to say it?
Yeah. Well, there's I think some of the ways of doing business in Mexico, which are not necessarily, which predate or what's the right word, aren't necessarily exclusive to doing cartel dirty work. Sort of sometimes leave the practices leave something to be desired. Let's put it that way.
Sure, understood. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
George Palmer.
Yes, sir.
How much involvement is China in Mexico? Where are the fingerprints for them? You know, recently they bought a general, which is part of the Communist Party, bought a couple of 100,000 acres just on the other side in Texas. I found out recently they almost tried to buy the YO ranch. What's going on with China along the border and in Mexico?
I was just going to say China is a lot bigger in other Latin American countries. Just go to South America and you see the influence. I go to Argentina from time to time. China's setting up military infrastructure down there. Wants to do an Antarctic base. China is definitely a player in Latin America. And you look at a lot of it was the COVID vaccines that they brought in. It was sort of a form of diplomacy. They just, for whatever reason, have not. I think the issue with Mexico is that Mexico has always been a competitor or China's been seen as a competitor, and cheap Chinese imports really, quite possibly, didn't allow Mexico to benefit from NAFTA like they had hoped.
John, do you want to talk about the Fentanyl?
Well, not specifically about China. There is some interaction between cartels that are getting involved in fentanyl manufacturing, importing precursor chemicals from China. The fentanyl labs that they're setting up, that are manufacturing this stuff in northern Mexico, so they don't have.
Just quickly, one of the reasons why the port of Manzanillo, for example, has so much violence is that it's for the Jalisco new generation cartel. That is so important to bring in. They got going about 2010. Their big thing is meth, and so they need chemicals coming in. And in Michoacan, there was definitely for a long time there was chemicals coming in and iron ore going out.
Going to the Pacific, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. If I could say, going back to the earlier question about remittances, the one thing that occurred to me to mention, the remittances, to David's point about them disproportionately going to cartel areas, one of the things that we discovered with the migrant crisis and the border crisis this past year in 2021 was that the cartels that were controlling the flow of migrants over the Rio Grande, who are sort of releasing them in strategic ways, the cartels were keeping track of who was crossing the river with these wristbands, and some of you may have read about this, a wristband system. Those wristbands correspond to databases that these cartels had. They had information on each migrant that crossed, how much they had paid, how much they owed, who their families were back in the sending countries, what the contact information for those families were, what the addresses were. And this includes family units, right, that are applying for asylum and that are getting released after a few days after being apprehended by Border Patrol. These folks that are coming into the United States and who are being released to go off to wherever there is that they're going, the cartels in many cases know where they're going to in the United States. They know their number, they know all the information about them, and these people, these migrants, owe the cartels thousands and thousands of dollars. They're essentially in debt bondage to these criminal organizations, which is why, I'm speculating, but you can infer why some of these remittances are disproportionately going to cartel areas.
But I even remember going in Guatemala. I went with the TPBF, did a story on Central America there, and I remember talking with the head of a business chamber, and he talked about remittances, and he just said, "There's something fishy about these numbers. It's not. It's not just." He sort of was more or less inferring it just wasn't just migrants sending home some money that people used to make ends meet.
There's a laundering system. I want to go to next.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I want to make sure we get as many questions as we can. So next, Chastity, please.
Yes, thank you. The question that I haven't heard you address is one that worries me, and that is the human trafficking that has skyrocketed across our border with Mexico, and the influx of people into Mexico for the human trade. So it's not a, from what I've been reading, it's not a Mexicans being brought to the U.S. entirely. It's people from all over Central America being pulled into the machine and being pushed our way, and then enormous amounts of dollars, which talks about your remittances, with renewable resource, if you can even imagine people being that.
Not just Central America.
Well, no, I think one thing the Biden administration wants to do is fix Central America and fix governance, and I will support them on that. I think bad governance in Central America does drive a lot of migration. It also, but what's happening, unfortunately, or I'll say, it's worldwide. You have Nicaraguans who used to go down to Costa Rica are now heading north in large numbers. Venezuelans, there was 4 million Venezuelans, I believe, who left and went to all over South America. They're now heading north. You have a lot of Cubans. You have they've always been a sizable presence. A lot of Haitians, and then people even coming from this. I remember in Tapachula meeting people from as far away as Bangladesh and Italy and India.
And there's a colony of Cameroonians in Nuevo Laredo as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I
remember. Yes, and Piedras Negras. Yeah.
So the thing about the point about human trafficking is I think it was Chief Scott, Rodney Scott, said this on at some point, maybe down in Del Rio. A lot of these people don't know they're being trafficked. They think that they are migrating, and they don't find out that they're being trafficked until well after they're inside the United States. For the group of people who are trying to get in and evade detection, they have to get over the border, then they have to get past border checkpoints. They get picked up and taken to Austin or Houston or Dallas, and then from there go on. But they're in the control of some other person, and they don't necessarily know where they're going, and they don't know who they're with, and a lot of them are being trafficked and are not aware of it for quite some time.
I would just say quickly that there's the director of the INM, the former director, he just told me flat out, he goes, it just seems to be the human trafficking is an issue that the U.S., Mexico, and Central America just have never, ever gotten to really tackled.
One last question, please.
Thank you. I think John knew this question was coming, but
Mario Loyola.
Thank you. So I like to tell my mother I hate to deprive you guys of a valid reason to be worried about something, but Mexico City, where I saw you guys recently, is one of my very favorite places to visit in the whole world. I would seriously consider living there if I could. Mexico's full of, San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, just absolutely magical places that are lovely to visit and where I've always felt safe. And at the national level, this occurs to me too, that even this most left-wing government that we have in Mexico right now has really been amazingly pro-American, and even when I was in Washington, D.C., pro-Trump, which really surprised me. Discuss. Isn't there like a considerable potential upside in Mexico if we can just help them capture it?
Well, we have 60 seconds, so there won't be this discussion, yeah. But I do want to push back briefly, and then I'll kick it over to David and John. They are pro-American, and AMLO is pro-American to the extent that we don't inquire too closely into their affairs. But I would never describe a government that cooperates with, facilitates the things that the Mexican state currently does as a friendly government. That's a value judgment that I'm happy to make. So, please.
I wouldn't describe. I take a more sanguine view. He did get along very well with President Trump, yeah. And I think part of that was just that they sort of have a similar political styles. But I think a lot of it was that López Obrador knew what Trump wanted, and that was action on migration, and he was willing to do it. And as the former head of the INM once told me, he just said, President Trump was this is a person that resigned after President Trump forced a deal on Mexico to take action on migration. He said Mexico has basically adopted, the U.S. that narrative, and in some ways, as another person told me, Mexico is doing Mexico's dirty work. People in Mexico don't get too excited about raids by the INM on breaking up migration caravans. It's very interesting how there's a large Mexican diaspora here, but when it comes to migrants passing through Mexico, a lot of the population is very indifferent or even hostile.
John, do you have a short comment to wrap this up?
There is, Mexico City is a wonderful place. It is a very cosmopolitan city, and I think that the people who are in charge in Mexico City are largely divorced from sort of thinking about the border or worrying about the border or what the border might mean to the U.S. politically. And it's hard to even convey that to them, that this isn't just a theoretical problem among other problems, but because of the politics in the United States, Trump ran largely on the border in 2016 and transformed American politics, I would argue. If you neglect it's not an issue that can be ignored, right? As much as some of the Mexico City elites would like to ignore it, it can't be ignored. And it's also its own industry now. It's in an industry that involves the Mexican state to some degree and involves very powerful criminal organizations. So, yeah, it was nice that AMLO sent the National Guard to the Mexico-Guatemala border after Trump threatened a 5% tariff on Mexican imports. But I think the way that played out, and we don't have time to discuss it here, showed that outsourcing U.S. immigration policy to the Mexican state is not a long-term solution and is not the basis for durable
It's one that's been endorsed, but that has been adopted by President Biden. The reason is that if he doesn't outsource, if Mexico doesn't do migrant enforcement, the alternative is that you militarize the U.S. border.
And with that happy prognostication, don't threaten me with a good policy time. Thank you for coming. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to David Agren and John Davidson, who have done a lot of yeoman's work in some bad places around the world, and we're very grateful for that. A few things. One, if you're interested in the writing that we've done, the explorations that we've done in Mexico City and the border and elsewhere, when you leave, go to the publications table, and there is a booklet called The Homestead, which has thousands of words, every one of them a jewel, on all the work that we've done on the border and in Mexico City and beyond. One last thing, why should we care about this? We should care about it not because, not Mexico for Mexico's sake, although I think all of us wish Mexico well, especially those of us from South Texas, but because this directly affects Texas communities, Texas homes, Texas security, and that's why we care, and that's why we have an obligation to understand it. Thank you all for coming to this, and that's it. That's the panel, guys. So thank you. Now, I know there's a video now. Clint is panicking because he thinks I haven't read the script. But now I have to change my tone completely because I'm going to show you a video about New England, which is a nice place that borders on a much more stable country. So, there has never been a populated Narragansett Bay that was not centered around fishing. You see the tone change? Settlements dating back to 5000 BC show signs of fishing activity that has continued to this present day. The only continent in a region that has seen so much change. From Block Island to Long Island, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, fishing vessels still bring to the surface some of our nation's most abundant resources. There's a Billy Joel song about this, just FYI. Many families have been fishing in these waters for generations, sustainably and safely working hard to preserve this precious bounty. But there's a new threat. A threat both above and below the surface. Planned wind farms could disrupt sensitive seabed environments, chase away key species, and endanger the fishermen themselves with dozens of towering windmills and hundreds of miles of buried transmission lines. The Texas Public Policy Foundation is proud to represent some of these families, and we recently filed a lawsuit seeking to stop development of these ill-considered government-supported wind projects. So, this next video, which is considerably more uplifting than any discussion we could have of Mexico, is going to tell the stories of some of the families we represent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again.
Watch that old fire as it flickers and dies. that once blessed the household and lit up our lives. It shone for the friends and the clinking of glasses. I'll tend to the flame, you can worship the ashes. Capture the wild things and bring them in line, and on what was never your right to confine. The lives and the loves and the songs are what matters. I'll tend to the flame, you can worship the ashes. Do you feel heavy, your eyes drop with grief? Your spirit is wild and your suffering is brief. So never you buckle and bend to the masses. I'll tend to the flame, you can worship the ashes. Get round a fire with a glass of strong ale and tell us a story from beyond the pale. Bury some seeds and expect some strong branches. I'll tend to the flame, you can worship the ashes. Now show me a man that can meet all his needs. For what we need most now is unity, see. A common old song for all creeds and all classes. I'll tend to the flame.
Your grandpa started doing this in the 1920s. Obviously, the nets were a lot smaller back then, a lot easier to handle, but he didn't have net drums. And not until 97 did we have a net drum.
Lap of luxury.
Huh?
I said it's a lap of luxury now.
Yeah, right. Well, the industry itself, problems are endemic. There's always going to be something going on, and we've been fortunate enough to work through them. You know, regulations and obviously weather, but this wind thing has me really scared, really scared.
The scariest thing about this 25-year plan, which we know isn't going to work, is the fact that they're going to take a piece of bottom, and the only thing, if they don't work, that has to be removed is the above ground structure. So where they all attach to the bottom of the ocean, whether it's a monopile, concrete, that's going to remain. So even if the windmills are taken off the surface of the ocean, there's still going to be a footprint on the bottom that we're not going to be able to work around. Once the windmills are in, we're done.
I used to be a snob. I went to school to become a reporter, got my degree. My dream job was to be sitting in Paris, smoking Gauloise as the New York Times stringer for Paris. That was it. And then I moved to a town of 3,000 people. What I learned over time is that I was a snob because I thought, because I'd been to college, that I knew more. And then I met my husband, and I knew nothing about fishing. You don't even have to catch fish. Just go 70 miles offshore, blowing 30 with 20-foot seas, and just bring the boat back. It's a completely different profession. December 1996.
December 1996. Whiting, mixed fish, squid, butterfish in the outside hole. At night, transiting through them, you can't see them. I'm going to be pushed into one of those wind scams rapidly. The company, Orsted, or one of the companies, had their own service vessel. The guy admitted that he shut the radars off, put them on standby, didn't have radars. 7 people were severely injured because he hit one of his wind scams because the light was out on it.
I mean, it's not a benign venture to pile drive the ocean floor and then liquefy it 6 to 8 feet to lay thousands of miles of cables underneath and then juice it with electromagnetic frequency and then see what happens. It's not about clean and green. The only green that is involved in this project is that which lines investors' pockets. And the media is being sold a facade and a lie.
Our entire business relies on these vessels going and harvesting the fish and the squid that they harvest, and then they sell it to us, and then we sell it on from there. If they're not catching fish and it's not coming through this building, we don't have a business. Some fishermen that I know, they just won't let their kids anywhere near the boat because they don't want their kids to love it like they did and then make it their life too, because they're looking at the future with a lot of fear. If the government is willing to sacrifice our businesses for the sake of foreign governments, then that's unacceptable, and our only recourse is the courts.
The way that offshore wind came in was essentially, it was like the Scandinavian mafia. Right. Came in and was like, we're taking your fishing grounds, and it was like, no, you're not.
They're all coming in and buying these grounds up, which means these guys that have worked their lives can no longer do their jobs. And at that point, our federal government isn't fighting for the Americans that represent the fleet that's already there, but are opening the door and saying, come on in, we'll take more money, and push them off to the side. That's completely unacceptable.
I started fishing with Aaron's grandfather. I started on deck. When he got sick, I ran the boat for a while, saved up some money, bought my first boat, which is a little 40-foot wooden boat. Worked that for a while, bought a bigger boat. When the boys came along, I knew I needed boats for them. And that was what was instilled in me by my father. To be an American, like my family's been for hundreds of years, that's the deal. You put your head down, you go to work, and you try to progress.
When love just seems so far away, keep holding, keep holding. The tide will flood your heart someday. Keep holding, boys. When you're guided.
These are your fellow American citizens, hardworking, family people that have worked their whole lives to provide you with food, and now their entire way of life, their entire business, and their family's futures are at the brink. As Americans, we fight for each other, and that's what we're doing now.
Keep holding, boys. If you fought so hard and you lost your hold, keep holding, keep holding. Remember, faith rewards the bold. Keep holding, boys. Keep holding, ho. Rouse and raise your voice. Hold your course and don't let go. Keep holding, boys. Whatever your ship and wherever your sea, keep holding, keep holding. Whatever your storm or your rocks may be, keep holding, boys. Keep